Good day, everyone, most especially to our dearest professor, Dr. Cecilia Calub. I am Rose Pearl Peralta, and tonight I will be discussing about poetry, specifically its meaning, characteristics, and the three main types. So before discussing other details about it, let's first focus on the definition of poetry. Poetry is seen as an art form in which human language is used for its aesthetic qualities. Also, it consists largely of oral or literary works in which language is used in a manner that is felt by its user and audience to differ from ordinary prose. Also, another description of poetry is that it often described as literature in metrical form or compositions forming rhythmic lines. Furthermore, it has a set of specific features that differentiate it from other forms of literature very clearly. And lastly, poetry is often created from the need to escape the logical as well as expressing feelings and other emotions. Now, at this point, we are going to talk about the characteristics of poetry. Poetry has different characteristics, some of which are imaginative, unique, uses imagery, thought provoking, triggers emotional response, and often has rhyme and rhythm. Let's further discuss the characteristics of poetry. First, poetry is imaginative. Poetry is imaginative in nature as it entails the writer or poet to use his imagination to come up with a scene that he aims to portray using his words. We have to remember that a writer's imagination is part of the driving force that inspires him to come with meaningful literature. We say that it is only part of a driving force because one part of the inspiration would come up into his literary pieces would be his or her experiences and ideas. Next, poetry is also unique. Remember that since part of the factors that influence a writer to come up with poetry or any literary piece in general is his or her experience and ideas, it can be said that each poem is unique. So we have to bear in mind that each individual experiences are unique and that no two experiences are alike. Therefore, the literary works that we are creating are all unique because it reflects our personal ideas, personal experiences, and personal opinions regarding a particular topics or regarding a particular issue or a particular theme we are writing about. The next characteristic is that poetry uses imagery. Poetry aims to let the readers be able to be a part of the scene that is portrayed by the writer. In order to do so, the writer needs to make use of imagery. We have to remember that the use of imagery allows the poet to paint pictures and include elements that appeal to the senses of the readers. Another characteristic is that poetry is thought provoking. Poetry tends to reflect the personal insights and ideas of the writer. As such, its contents are open to the interpretation of the readers. We have to take note that the contents of poems influence readers to analyze the literature in accordance with the writer's intentions. Next, poetry triggers emotional response. Since poetry reflects the ideas, insights, emotions, and intentions of the writer, if written well, it tends to elicit empathy or sympathy from the readers. It is worth noting that one of the aims of poetry is to let the readers be able to relate to the theme presented by the writer in the poem. Remember that each particular poem is based on a specific theme, and a poem is considered to be effective if the reader is able to feel or empathize whatever the emotions that the writer is including in his or her poetry. Lastly, poetry often has rhyme and rhythm. Much like in music, poetry also follows the principle of having a rhyming pattern and meter to add beauty to the piece. However, it is worth noting that not all forms of poetry follow this premise. Hence, I indicated the term often because not all form of poetry would follow a rhyming scheme or a meter. Now, the existing of pre-verse poems proves that poetry does not necessarily need a rhyming scheme or meter just like what I have mentioned earlier. Now, let us proceed to the three main types of poetry, which are the lyric poetry, narrative poetry, and dramatic poetry. So first we have the lyric poetry. Lyric poetry is one of the three main genres of poetry. Lyric comes from the Latin word lyricus, meaning for the lyre. These short poems were originally accompanied by music. Lyrics poems often have a refrain or lines that are repeated throughout the poem. So, in lyric poetry, the mood is melodic and emotional. The writer uses words that expresses his or her state of mind, perceptions, and feelings rather than tell a story. Here is one of the example of a lyric poetry. Go Lovely Rose is a lyric poem with four quatrains or four-line stanzas in which the speaker addresses a rose he is sending to a young lady. It was first published in 1645 in Poems, a collection of Waller's work. It is among the most famous and most admired short poems in English literature. The poem begins with the speaker asking a rose to speak with the woman he loves. It is through the beauty of the rose he to convince the woman of a number of things. The most important of these is that he is worth loving and she is worth admiring. He no longer wants her to hide from him. The speaker believes her beauty and time on earth is going to waste because she does not allow him to look at her. The poem concludes with the speaker telling the rose to die after speaking with the woman. This final shock will further motivate the woman to come forward and stop, he thinks, wasting her time. There are different types of lyric poetry. The first one is the elegy. An elegy is a very sad poem, often expressing sorrow over someone who has died. Elegies are typically written in couplets that have a specific pattern of meter. So, an example of elegy is the poem by Walt Whitman about a captain who dies just as his ship has reached the end of a stormy and dangerous voyage. The captain represents Abraham Lincoln, who was assassinated just as the Civil War was ending. Next type of lyric poetry is the ode. Ode is a lyric poem in the form of an address to a particular subject, often elevated in style or manner and written in varied or irregular meter. So an ode is a lyric poem with a complicated structure that praises a person or marks an important event. Odes are generally meant to be performed with music. An example of ode is the poem by Mark Twain entitled The Ode of Stephen Dowling Butts. So next we have sonnet. A sonnet is a fixed verse lyric poem that has 14 lines. Sonnets are often about a thought of feeling and have a final line that summarizes the theme. There are different types of sonnets. The English sonnet has three quatrains and a final separately rhymed couplet. The most famous writer of sonnets is William Shakespeare, who wrote over 150 sonnets. So, an example of sonnet is the poem by William Shakespeare entitled Sonnet 18. Shakespeare uses Sonnet 18 to praise his beloved's beauty and describe all the ways in which their beauty is preferable to a summer day. The stability of love and its power to immortalize someone is the overarching theme of this poem. Also, sonnets are usually a love poem. Next, the narrative poetry. Narrative poetry tells stories through verse. Like a novel or a short story, a narrative poem has plot, characters, and setting. Using a range of poetic techniques such as rhyme and meter, narrative poetry presents a series of events, often including action and dialogue. Each type of poetry has distinct characteristics and functions. While lyric poems emphasize self-expression, the narrative poems emphasize plot. However, the distinction between genres may blur as poets weave lyrical language into narrative poems. Similarly, a narrative poem might resemble dramatic poetry when the poet incorporates more than one narrator. Therefore, the defining feature of narrative poetry is the narrative arc. However, narrative poetry is an ever evolving art, and there are countless other ways to tell stories through verse. So, the example of a narrative poetry is the work of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow entitled The Song of Hiawatha. So, the Song of Hiawatha by American poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow narrates Native American legends in metrical verse that mimics the Finnish national epic, the Kalevala, and in return, the Kalevala echoes early narratives such as the Iliad and the Beowulf. Longfellow's long poem has all the elements of classical epic poetry: a noble hero, a doomed love, gods, magic, and folklore. Despite its sentimentality and cultural stereotypes, the Song of Hiawatha suggests the hunting rhythms of Native American chants and establishes a uniquely American mythology. Just like lyric poetry, narrative poetry also has different types. Narrative poems vary in style and have changed over the ages as both language and literary trends have evolved. Some were composed with the intention of being sung and danced to, while others are written to record human history. So the first narrative poet type of poetry is the epics. Epic poems were composed by ancient Greek poets like Homer and were intended to be recited rather than read. Epics are written in a grandiose style and tell stories of historical events or legends of cultural importance. One example of an epic poem passing down history is Homer's The Iliad, which contains a long passage called the Catalogue of Ships. We also have the ballads. Ballads derive from the French chanson ballade, which were poems set to music and intended for dancing. Because of its strong musical background, ballads are associated with a specific meter. Ballads are typically written with alternating lines of iambic tetrameter and iambic trimeter, with every second and fourth line rhyming. They were most popular in Ireland and Britain starting in the Middle Ages, but also gained popularity around Europe and on other continents. Ballads may be relatively short narrative poems compared to other types of narrative poetry. In the type of narrative poetry, we also have the Arthurian romances. Arthurian romances derive from the 12th century France. They are any narrative poetry that tells stories of romance and adventure within the Arthurian court. King Arthur was an English ruler in the 5th and 6th centuries, best known for fighting off the Saxon invasions. According to some scholars, however, Arthur never existed but was instead a fictional character. Lastly, the dramatic poetry. Dramatic poetry is written in verse and is meant to be spoken or acted out, usually to tell a story or portray a situation. Most dramatic poetry is in the form of dramatic monologues, which are long speeches by one actor to another or the audience, or soliloquies, which are one's thoughts spoken out loud regardless of whether anyone hears them or not. Dramatic poetry differs from narrative poetry in that it is written and told by the perspective of the character, while narrative poetry is a story told by the narrator. Dramatic poetry, also known as dramatic verse or verse drama, and it is a written work that both tells the story and connects the reader to an audience through emotions or behavior. So the example of dramatic poetry is the work of William Blake entitled The Tiger. So the Tiger is William Blake's most widely taught poem. Its repetitive style and short length make it accessible to young readers, but the topic it explores is anything but childish. In The Tiger, Blake not only explores the coexistence of good and evil, but he also questions the source of their existence, asking how a single creator would create both beauty and horror. The poem resonates with modern readers because its essential question remains unanswered. Questions like, why do good people suffer? And how can good people do bad things? Both tie in with the poem's premise. While the tiger can be understood on a surface level without much prior knowledge, and it is also includes powerful metaphors and a number of religious and classical allusions that can enrich analysis and interest advanced students. So again, poetry is probably one of the most common means of expressing oneself, his emotions, insights, ideas, opinions, and experiences. Before I end my report, here is a quotation by Muriel Raki Sir. Breath in experience, breath out poetry. So if you cannot become a poet, let's be the poem. So that ends my presentation for tonight. Thank you for listening. Keep safe everyone. May the grace of God be with all of us. God bless. Bye.